great to be here. Well, in a virtual way, I'm actually sitting in my living room at the moment. But what interests me about this paper that I'm going to give, addressing you and engaging in a conversation with you, is that psychotherapeutic practice has become very central to my theological project in the last kind of 5 years. I'm getting a tiny bit of feedback. I wonder what that's coming from. Okay. Yeah, so psychotherapeutic ideas and theory have become very central to my own kind of philosophical and theological project. And it's not just that I'm interested in, psychotherapy as a practice or how psychotherapy can be used within the church. What I'm interested in is the way that psychotherapy, psychotherapeutic ideas or metapsychology can be used to help us understand theology in a deeper way, can help us understand church practice in a different way, and can actually bring out some potentiality within theology that we may have missed. So what I want to do in this paper is explore the relation between psychotherapeutic practice and church practice. And I want to explore what I consider really one of the central insights of the pastoral movement and how it can help us understand what we should be doing within church life in a better way. Okay, I need to talk a little bit louder, so I'm going to project. I hope you can let me know if there's any problems with listening to me. Type it on the side screen. I have my microphone switched off so that I don't hear any feedback. Okay, so the conversation partner that I want to engage with during this paper is Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich is really one of the only canonical theologians in the West who took seriously, the depth psychology. And by depth psychology, I'm referring to any therapeutic practice that takes into consideration the unconscious, that sees the consciousness not as the center of our being, but sees the unconscious as operating and often subverting our daily lives. So Paul Tillich engaged seriously with psychoanalysis. He felt that it had something to offer theology, and he felt that these two disciplines of theology and psychoanalysis could interpenetrate each other. So I want to look at a little bit about what Paul Tillich thinks, but I also want to disagree with him and use him as a foil to explore kind of my own thinking. So to begin with, I want to say the historian Patrick O'Farrell once said that if religion is the opium of the people, then the Irish are addicts. And I'm from Northern Ireland, and I think he was referring to the fact that in Northern Ireland we're like the Bible Belt of Europe. There's churches on every corner. There's still high church attendance, and Catholicism has really has interpenetrated the culture. But in some respects, you could say that this religious spirit has been taken over by America, but not in terms of the church, but actually in terms of secular culture. So, if you define religion not in terms of belief in God, but if you define religion the way Schleiermacher defined it as the experience of absolute dependence, and what comes out of that experience of absolute dependence, this sense that there is something above and beyond us that we are connected to, then you could say that religion is rife, not just in the churches, but actually outside the churches. Traditionally, religion had, two roles that it played, at least two roles. One of them was that religion gave a plumb line with which to define the truth or falsity of another position. So, you take Christianity, it was the truth. and everything else and all other religious traditions were compared and contrasted to it. And insofar as another person agreed with something in Christianity, they were experiencing or expressing the truth. And insofar as they said something that was different, they were kind of in error. So Christianity became this plumb line which defined everything else. And you even see it in the very term religion, because the very term religion came out of Christianity. And so what happened is people said, well, Christianity is the true religion. It's what religion is. And so we are going to compare and contrast everything else to see what is a religion and what isn't. So by definition, everything was compared and contrasted to the kind of the Christianity at the time to see whether it was a religion or not. Hence, Islam would be seen as a religion, Judaism, yep. And then Buddhism was a little bit more complicated, Hinduism, a little bit more complicated. And then, you got to things like, football or sports, and you go like, is that really a religion or not? So everything was being compared to Christianity. So that's one thing that religion gives its adherents a way of seeing the world, which allows them to judge who they come in contact with. There's an old analogy from Belfast, where I'm from, that I think it's a true story actually. During the conflict, this guy was walking down the street, and these lads stopped him and said, "Are you a Catholic or a Protestant?" And this was a way of defining what side of the conflict you were on. And the guy said, "Well, I'm actually from Iran, and I'm a Muslim." And one of the guys says, "That's all very well, but are you a Protestant Muslim or are you a Catholic Muslim?" And what I think this analogy, that anecdote expresses, is that for us in Northern Ireland, everything was seen through whether you were a Protestant or a Catholic. Everything was filtered into that. So if you were a Muslim, you still fitted somehow. It was the universal discourse with which we kind of understood everything, which is of course very natural. We all do that. But the question is whether we let the other position also impact us. That's another story. The second thing that religion often traditionally did was it offered a type of escape from the suffering of life. It gave promises to a kind of wholeness, a type of promise that the suffering and the lack that is within us, the difficulties that we're facing, can be healed. That salvation is possible either in this life or the next. That we all feel a kind of a gap and a suffering in existence. And religion can offer a consolation. And so that's what Marx was talking about when he talked about religion as an opium, as a painkiller. It's something that you do when life is a burden. And that religion offers this consolation. Now, interestingly, these two roles are seen more and more in a secular way. So I live in California at the moment, and California seems to be a deeply religious environment. If you take, for example, New Age spirituality, it offers now a plumb line discourse. So when you talk to somebody about kind of, some sort of higher consciousness or something like that, there is this sense in which that is the truth of all religions. That's the truth that's lying behind everything else. And it helps you understand, what's good in different religious traditions and what's bad. So it operates in a similar way to the discourse of the church. But more importantly, they offer also a form of healing and wholeness and escape from your suffering. So for example, there's a new drug called ayahuasca. Now it's not a new drug, but it's kind of a lot of people are taking it now in America, and it's seen as the God drug, the drug that can connect you with your deeper self, that can take away all the layers of defenses and can help you engage directly with the divine or the spirit or the universe itself. And so what you find is the promises that people are making about ayahuasca are the same promises that people once made and still do to a certain extent make within the church. That your pain can be taken away, you can connect with the divine, you can be one with God. You can be whole. You can experience, in a sense, like they talk about like an insight, like enlightenment through taking this drug. But you also see it in new forms of technology. My friend Kester Bruin is writing a book called Getting High, which looks at how technology is trying to get us out of our finitude and into some sort of higher plane. He talks about how some new technologies are promising eternal life, which is once what was promised by the church, that we'll be able to digitally download our consciousness into software, into the internet. It's promising us connection with each other through that. So whenever we're all digitally downloaded into the internet, we'll be able to communicate instantly. We'll be able to travel at the speed of light or faster than light. We'll have omniscience. We'll be able to kind of be in multiple places at the same time. And so these were all promises that were once in the church, but now are being made by kind of the new, kind of what's called transhumanism. In fact, if you've seen the film Lucy, Lucy explores this, where a woman actually becomes God. That in this kind of transhumanism, the very idea that God doesn't exist, but God may one day exist, that we could become like gods, is seen as a reasonable proposition. Even in kind of philosophical materialism, there's this idea that we could develop significantly beyond our current limitations and enter into a new form of life. A philosopher called Quentin Meillassoux has talked about how God may one day exist, that God could come into existence, and this is from a materialist position. Even actually Alain de Botton, one of the new atheists, is talking about creating kind of a religion around new atheism, and what it offers is a constellation. It offers what religion once offered, a way of helping us feel at peace with ourselves. So, these are all kind of religious moves. So in some respects, religion, if you're talking about theism, is maybe on a decrease. But if you're talking about religion as this experience of dependence, this desire for knowledge, and this desire for wholeness, then that continues to exist in a strong form. Now, in many ways, psychotherapeutic methods stand fundamentally against this. Traditionally, psychotherapy is all about attempting to wrestle with your brokenness and your suffering and your sense of lack, coming to terms with that, and not trying to kind of run away from it, not trying to solve it with kind of some sort of drug. Traditionally, anything like, say, alcohol, if someone's an alcoholic, that's not the problem, that's the solution to a problem. And what one has to do is look at why the person is drinking, help them come to terms with that, and then they will no longer need to drink. So anything that offers like this painkiller to life is generally kind of rejected by the psychotherapeutic method. And part of the reason for that is because in psychotherapy, this lack is very much a part of who we are. It's constitutive of human experience. It's constitutive of being a creature of language, of experiencing separation and difference. Separation from other people, separation from myself, that this is not something that can be overcome. And that anyone who promises it can be overcome, ultimately, there is a form of deception going on. Because what happens is, either we can't get what we want, that we think will make us happy, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a certain drug, whether it's a certain new technology, whatever it is that we think will make us whole and complete, we either don't get it, and we're depressed and we're sad and we blame other people for that, or we get it. We actually get the thing that we believe will make us whole and complete. And then we discover that it doesn't work. Now, It might make our lives better. It might improve our lives a little bit, but it doesn't get rid of the constitutive lack. If we think that, for example, the other part, the person we are sexually attracted to, that when we finally are with them, it's going to be wonderful and life is going to be great. That's a type of illusion that helps to cover over the fundamental anxiety and the fundamental trauma of existence. Paul Tillich talks about three forms that anxiety take. There's the anxiety of meaninglessness, where someone feels, in a weak way, they might feel, what I'm presently doing doesn't have a purpose. And the strong form of that is anything I would do doesn't have a purpose. There's guilt, the weak form of guilt, which is like, I could be a nicer person to my mother or, to my friends. And then the strong form, condemnation, where you go, you know what, there's something that I'm completely lacking in. I can never be fully the type of person that I would like to be. And then the third is death. And the weak form of death is kind of whenever something happens, like I go to the doctors because I'm not well, I think I'm sick, and the doctor says, no, everything's fine. And you go, oh my goodness, I'm so relieved, I nearly died. And then the strong form is when you realize that you are going to die. It's not like because you don't have cancer, you're not going to die. You're going to die of something eventually. And so for Tillich, these are three ways in which nothingness gets into our lives. Each of them are a form of nothingness. Death, obviously, the incoming of nothingness. But guilt, the lack of something, I'm not living up to something. Meaninglessness, the idea that I don't have meaning. So all of these are negations. They're all lacks, and they all can impact our lives, no matter how great they are. So there are the traumas that happen to us, and there are the traumas that happen to exist simply because we are beings who are self-aware, who have language. And so even if we've grown up in the best possible way, in the Freudianite sense, there is still a difficulty to life. And that generates this pursuit of something that will fix us, something that will make everything better. And so, today the church doesn't have much credibility in a lot of places, at least in Europe, in terms of offering that. But advertising does. It's a billion-dollar industry, promising that you can be happy and content and you can have what you need, that if only you look a certain way, if only you buy a certain product, if only you go out with a certain person, everything is going to be fine. And so there is a super ego injunction to enjoy. And that in contemporary therapy is seen as a deep problem. That's what generates a deep unhappiness. The more that we think we should be enjoying life and the more complete we should be, the more we either pretend to ourselves that we have that. And you see this in like Facebook and in social media, where people carefully curate their online image so that, pictures where they're all happy, they're always talking about their relationship, they're always talking about how kind of like they're going on holiday, and there's pictures of their coffee they're drinking and the lovely food they're having. And there's this kind of sense in which we have it, we have the happiness. And of course, as anybody knows in therapy, often if someone's obsessively saying how happy they are, that's a form of saying how unhappy they are. Because if someone's genuinely happy, they generally don't need to obsessively show it to everybody. The happiest people are the ones who are generally quite quiet, probably on social media. They don't need it. And so if I see one of my friends obsessively, projecting an image of happiness, my concern is, potentially something difficult is going on in their relationship or in their life. But we carefully create this. Or the alternative is we begin to hate other people because we think that they have the happiness that we don't. We believe that there's something out there that we're lacking, and we see other people enjoying it. This is what you see in an extreme form in Elliot Rodgers. Elliot Rodger, went out on a shooting spree on the west coast of America. And he left a series of YouTube videos, and he left a 107-page document outlining kind of the inner workings of his mind. And what you see in this is he's continually looking at everybody else and saying they're having all the sex, they're having all the parties, I'm kind of excluded from the social networks. It was as if everybody was having so much fun around him, and it was crushing him. And he went out and he kind of took revenge on the people around him. And it was a form of selfless revenge, in a sense, in the sense that he was destroying himself. He so hated the other for having the happiness that he didn't have, that he was willing to destroy himself in order to wreak revenge on the other. You see this even in King Solomon, whenever two women come to Solomon, and one woman says, her child died, and she took my child and put it in her house, and she's pretending it is her child. And the other woman denies it. And then King Solomon, in his wisdom, says, well, cut the child in half, give each woman half the child, and that's fair. And of course, the one thing that will disappear in that is the actual life of the child. And so one of the women says, don't do it. Give the child to the other woman. Solomon understands who the child belongs to. But it also says that the other woman said, yes, cut the child in half. And the question really is, why did the other woman say, cut the child in half? What, why was she so willing to let a child die? And the answer to that therapeutically is that if we have lost what we think will make us whole and complete, and for this woman it would have been her child, she lost her child. So she loses what she thinks is central to her being. And then she looks at her neighbor and she sees that her neighbor has the thing that she thinks will make you whole and complete. That can generate such a deep level of jealousy and anger that we would even want the death of a child in order to take that away from the other. So there's this sense in which we fantasize that other people have the pleasure that we don't have, and we kind of hate them. We hate them for it. You see that in Hollywood, of course, where the enemy is often painted as having an excessive pleasure. The Joker in Batman has a smile etched onto his face. He's having excessive jouissance, excessive pleasure. And it's Batman who's unhappy, who's lost his love, who feels deeply melancholic, whose family were killed. So it's Batman who's unhappy, and it's the Joker who's happy. You see this in James Bond films, anything where the enemy has all of the money, all of the power, all of the sexual potency that is lacking from the other, and so we want to take that away from them. And this can even be expressed when you see it in, say, a church, where a pastor is shouting about how decadent society is, how bad it is, how much fun they're having out there, and how much sex they're having, and all of this kind of stuff. Where sometimes what you can dimly perceive in this negation, in this attack, is jealousy. It's like, look at all the fun they're having, right? So in the kind of like, I would never want that, what you hear is, I would want that if I could have it, right? Freud calls this negation, which is where someone says, I had a dream and it wasn't about my mother. And you go, okay, so it was probably about your mother, right? Because why else would you say that? Or, I don't mean to offend you when I say this. And you go, okay, so you want to offend me. So negation is where you deny something that you're affirming because you want to protect yourself from the insight that that's what you want, right? So the negation actually affirms. And you hear it in people who are jealous of like pop stars or whatever, whenever you kind of feel that, I think secretly they would really like that. So that's a kind of form of negation. Now, Paul Tillich, takes the psychotherapeutic method and says this can teach us something about theology. This method has something to say. And he looks at it in three ways. There's an essay he wrote called The Theological Significance of Existentialism and Psychoanalysis. And in that, he says that, psychoanalysis kind of offers the problem that we have, a sense of estrangement, a sense of lack, a sense of brokenness, alienation from our lives, from other people. So he gets all of that. He says, actually, the therapeutic method has deep insights into the struggles that human beings have. And this is one of the great developments of depth psychology. And he says that this can help us understand what sin means in a much deeper way, where sin had, become, doing something that was bad, right? Whether it's murder or whether it's kind of like stealing or whatever it is, sin becomes like this moral category. Tillich wants to say, no, it's something much deeper than that. It's not just moral wrongness. It actually gets to the core of our being. Sin is a form of experience of alienation. It's a form of estrangement from the ground of being, so that we feel, anxiety at the very core of our lives, even if we're morally good. Even if we don't do anything that's seen as bad, we are still in sin. And for him, psychoanalysis and depth psychology really helps theology return to, or even discover for the first time, the depth of that word and make it relevant again, rather than being some sort of outdated notion. And secondly, he thought that the therapeutic method could really help the church and help theology understand grace, the power of grace. The model of the analyst listening to the analysand, the person who's coming for analysis, who accepts radically who they are and what they say. This for Tillich is a paradigm of what grace looks like, where you are accepted, where you experience that you're accepted, and where you gradually come to accept that you are accepted. In a therapeutic setting, you realize quite quickly that there's nothing you can't say, that you can say everything, and that no one's going to come in and like stop you and say, you're not allowed to say that, you can't say that, or that's bad. Everything is put on the table, free association. And for someone like Tillich, he sees this as helping us understand what Paul meant in the connection between grace or law and sin. Where he says the more you say don't do something to somebody, the more it generates the desire to do it. The more you say to a child, don't open that door when I leave, the more the child then wants to open the door. That there's this relationship to, saying don't do something and the desire to do it, the libidinal desire to do it. And yet in an environment where you don't ask someone to change, where you don't demand that they reform their ways, where you simply accept them, that is where real change can happen. Whenever Paul says everything is permissible, just not everything is beneficial. This is kind of like a psychoanalytic insight that I'm not going to tell you to change. We're going to just let you talk. It's all through. But as you do that in a place of grace, you will begin to change. And you see that even in AA. In AA, at the very fundamental level, is the idea that you admit that you've got a problem. You talk about it in a room of people who accept you for who you are. And in AA, the idea is, well, that's the very first. It's not even a step. It's the very first thing. It's the conditions within which change can happen. And once you can do that, then there's the 12 steps, things you can do to help. But the very first thing you need is the place of absolute grace. And thirdly, Tillich in this article, he says that psychoanalysis can help us understand confession. The ritual in which you speak freely to a religious authority, for example, and you can say anything, and it's okay. And for Tillich, this is the paradigm for theology being able to understand again this idea that we accept the unacceptable, we express grace, we express a place of confession, which is the talking cure. That originally, the psychotherapeutic method was called the talking cure because it was seen that merely talking, not even understanding. There's a great work by Bruce Fink, 2 volumes, called Against Understanding, which is like the therapeutic method isn't even about understanding why you do something. The very act of speaking itself is curative or can be curative. So that's confession. And as they say, sin, the idea of estrangement. But where Tillich falls short, I think, is then he says, okay, that's the problem, and theology offers the solution. And I think at this point he kind of falls into the idea that theology can help us overcome our sense of estrangement. It can give us a sense of wholeness. It is actually the true promise that we can somehow be at peace with ourselves. We can fill that gap that Pascal talks about in the core of our being. And this is what I just want to spend the next 15 minutes or so questioning. Because I think actually, although Tillich is right in seeing the importance of psychotherapy and theology as interlinked, and he's right in seeing in psychotherapy and in pastoral care a model for how we in the church should understand grace, should understand confession, and should understand sin. He's failed to see the fundamental insight that the pastoral, that the psychotherapeutic has to offer to kind of the future of church, and the way that we can understand the role of church at its deepest level. Now, in order to see that, we need to look at the metapsychology and what the creation myth of metapsychology is. And very simply, it's the idea that when we are very young, we do not experience any separation in life. There is just a body that has a series of feelings and sensations. But there is a point in our human development very early on, in the mirror phase, when we, for the first time, experience a separation from other things. And that begins with a separation from the mother's breast. So our first experience of separation is really from a part of the mother, generally. And that is quite traumatic to us. Something else gets in the way between the relationship of the child and the mother, breaks that apart. It's something that's traumatic for the child, but the child has to gradually come to terms with it, and then they ultimately go and seek relationships elsewhere. And in analysis, that's called the name of the father. So there is this, and mother and father here obviously don't refer to literal mother and literal father. They refer to structural kind of moves that have to happen. So there is the mother, who's also called the other, who we feel connected to, that we've lost. And there is the name of the father, which is the law and language that comes in and separates us. And what happens is we feel we've lost something. And if the separation doesn't happen in a healthy way, we always want to return to the thing that we've lost. We want to go back to the mother. We want to somehow reconnect with the mother. And psychosis can be described as the experience where the separation doesn't really happen. So the psychotic, in some respects, doesn't fully differentiate between themselves and the other. And perversion is where the separation happens to some extent, but the perverse structure wants to return to the mother. And then neurosis can be within the Lacanian tradition. Neurosis is understood as, yes, the separation has happened, but we are, but we feel we've lost something very fundamental. So in a very, very simple way, that's kind of the Oedipal story that you find in metapsychology. And what happens in psychology is, or psychoanalysis, is that we're attempting to help people come to terms with that lack, with that distance, and move on with their lives without having to fill that, without returning to the original primordial source, because that's impossible in analysis. It's like the mother never existed, not as something that can make us whole and complete. That's a kind of fantasy that's created once we experience the separation. We then fantasize some sort of completeness, and that's the problem. And that's where like advertising and religion can come in and say, and we can offer that. We can offer the wholeness and the completeness. Now, if you take that theologically, you can actually have a very different reading of how we understand God, because God traditionally has been understood in a religious way as very much that thing that we are separated from, that we can return to, that can make us whole. And what I want to argue is that actually a radical reading of theology says, no, it's the exact opposite. Theology in the church is about helping us break up with that notion of God and help us become comfortable with our lack, and help us find God not as some sort of object that we return to, but rather God as this spectral presence in the midst of life itself. Right? So very quickly, you take Darren Aronofsky, the director. He made recently Noah. He also made his debut film was called Pi. What you'll notice structurally about both of these films is they are about psychosis, in a sense. They are about what happens when you get too close to the desire of God, right? You know, both of them, in Pi, it's about a guy who is looking for a number that will unlock the secrets of the universe. But this number is actually the name of God. And the closer he gets to it, the more crazy he gets, until he has to give himself a lobotomy. In Noah, it's about obviously Noah getting this command to build an ark, and as he kind of builds this ark, and he tries to be true to this demand, this desire of God, you see him begin to come apart as a human being. And at one point, he has to break away from that in order to retain his sanity. Now, in a similar way, you can read the covenants of the Hebrew text as ways of separating us from God. And by that, what I mean is, if you think of like a divorce settlement, if you go through a divorce, a contract is not designed to connect you with the other person. A contract is designed to separate you from the other person, from their desire. Because the other person might, want to have the kids, so they may decide that you shouldn't see them on a certain day, or if you have to pay the other person a certain amount of money, maybe eventually you'll just decide not to. And what a contract does is it says it doesn't matter what you desire, this is what you have to do, right? It doesn't matter what you want to do if this contract is what you're legally obliged to do. And so contracts separate you from the desire of the other. That allows you to get a bit of space and takes away anxiety. And in some respects, the covenants seem to operate in this way. They separate the people from the desire of God. As long as we do this, this will happen, and everything will run as normal, and everything will be cool. We don't have to kind of worry about things changing overnight. Floods or something coming. This is a contract. And that mimics the first step, what's called alienation in metapsychology, of the first step of separation from the mother, which is where you see yourself as different and you separate yourself from the mother's desire. But then the next step is you have to break away entirely. And the way that happens is you begin to understand that the other person, the mother, has desires of her own, and she can never be satisfied, that she is internally lacking as well. and that the child learns that they can never be the object of the mother's full desire, because that can never be filled. And this is called castration. Castration is the moment when you realize, in a sense, that you can't be the object of the other's pleasure, that you can't be, the phallus for the other, the object of desire for the other. And as you learn that, you move away and you're able to, get little parts of desire and, in other relationships. And psychoanalytically, you could say in theology, there is this moment on the cross when we experience God experiencing a lack within God. And what happens here is the experience of, in a sense, a death of a certain type of God. It's called death of God theology. It's not the death of theism. It's not necessarily the death of all gods. It's the death of the God who we think we have to return to be whole and complete. The God who offers the answer. What Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his Letters and Papers for Prison, called the Deus Ex Machina. The God who gives the answers to all of our questions. The God who satisfies us, makes it all great, wipes away every tear. So that God, we lose that God. That's the traumatic loss of God. One way of reading the tearing of the temple curtain is that we realize that there's nothing in the Holy of Holies. We realize that the God who we think is going to make everything whole and complete isn't there. But then what that opens us up to is the possibility of experiencing God as not that which helps us escape our lack, but rather as that which is found in our lack, that which we are never separated from, that which is found in the act of love, in the act of community, in the act of meeting together as a community, trying to show grace to one another. Something that I think is captured in the heart of the Eucharist, where you have, in a sense, the bread and the wine, which is, here's God, the bread and the wine. And then there is the consumption, which is the disappearance, the death of God, the disappearance of God. Where's God gone? And then there is the third step, which is the realization, we are the body of God in the world. This is us. God is here in the midst, not as an object that we love, but rather as found in the very act of love itself. Now, just to summarize the argument here, and then I'm hoping we can, discuss this a little bit more, is I'm basically comparing and contrasting the idea of God as the instrument of certainty and satisfaction. And in my book, The Idolatry of God, that's what I mean. That's where we idolatrize God. God becomes a product. God becomes the way that we can be happy, the promise that our finitude can be removed. And that God is found in secular forms more strongly than in religious and sacred forms. As I say, in new technologies, in new age spiritualities, in new materialisms, that God is still alive and well. But that Christianity in its radical form kills that God. That's what psychotherapy can teach us. That God is dead. That God is impotent. If we give ourselves to that God, we will become more depressed. We will become more unhappy. We will create scapegoats, people who we can blame because things aren't working, because things should work. We'll create destructive symptoms where, we will overeat. We will, we'll have hatred towards ourselves. We'll have hatred towards others. We'll, whatever, we'll watch too much television, whatever it is, the destructiveness will come out if we kind of worship that God. But instead, the church can be the place where the therapeutic method kind of plays out sacramentally, where people are accepted in their brokenness, grace, the acceptance that you're accepted unconditionally, They're able to talk about everything and anything without judgment. Confession, the place where everything can be spoken, and where we encourage through art, through liturgy, through hymns, through the sermon, we encourage people to be able to be honest about the stuff that's within them that they repress, bringing that to the surface. And sin, the idea that we are estranged, that we are alienated, that we experience nothingness in the forms of death, guilt, and meaninglessness, and purposelessness, and how in a community of grace and confession, that sense of estrangement and sin is not done away with. It's forgiven. And that's very different. To forgive a debt is not to pay a debt. If I forgive a debt, I'm not paying it. I'm rendering it nothing. I'm saying that debt is nothing, right? And debt is nothingness anyway, because a debt is a lack. So you're saying that lack is nothing. It's a forgiveness of sin. So the idea for me is the therapeutic model can help us understand that we don't get rid of sin. We rob it of its sting. We rob it of its sting through this grace and through this confession. And therefore, we have to be very wary of any time that the church begins to mimic an advertisement, where the ministers become salespeople, the worship are the jingles, and the church is the shop front, promising certainty, promising satisfaction, promising that you can escape your brokenness and escape your suffering. No, the good news of Christianity, I would argue, is life is difficult and you don't know the answers. That sounds like bad news at first. The good news is, no, you can be happy and you can have the answers. But I would say that generates anxiety and insecurity. And actually, it's the place where we can say, no, life is just really difficult sometimes. And even when it's good, and I'm struggling with stuff, and I'm full of unknowing, and I'm full of ghosts, and I'm full of brokenness. And I'm just being encouraged in this space to admit that. And I'm finding that where God is, the God that's being preached, is the God who is there in the midst of all of that. Not to take it away, but to allow me to bear that burden, to rob it of its sting. That's the good news. And that's, I think, what psychotherapeutic method can offer us in terms of understanding the role and the mission of church. So I think I've taken about 45 minutes, 50 minutes to offer those thoughts. I wonder if it's time to kind of hand over to you.
I, for one, really love the thought.
Oh,
so how?
I hear you.
Rick, are we going to have video or just audio?
I'm going to put in headphones, by the way, just so I can hear you more clearly. I can still hear you. I'm just behind my computer getting headphones.
Wish I could. So, Rick, I can't hear anything from Charlotte.
Okay, so I can hear all of you now.
Charlotte is here.
Oh, there you go, Jim.
Are we wanting to have this open to all of those who are hearing this presentation before hearing from our panel?
I think we're going to take questions now, and then we'll break off to our individual locations for our panel discussions.
All right.
Are the questions going to be typed or audible?
That was my question.
Oh, yeah.
Rick, are you there?
We're going to invite our panel as well to ask questions, along with the participants here in Charlotte. Dr. Susan Roddy from Charlotte.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. I work both in a counseling center part-time and in a United Church of Christ church. And so I'm going back and forth in my mind between both as you speak. And I think one of the questions I have is your understanding of resurrection and what that means in the context of what you've been talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, so interesting, Uniting Church I've worked a little bit with, and this kind of theology, by the way, is quite scary and terrifying to often the more contemporary church and the more kind of contemporary evangelical church. But what I find is when I'm working with kind of more traditional denominations, they're like, yeah, where's the big controversy here? You know, it's like, churches like Uniting Church, I think, are very close. In fact, really have this understanding already that God is not somehow found in this escape from our brokenness and our unknowing, but actually the liturgical structure is a way of almost entering into the unknowing and becoming at peace with that and finding some sort of kind of connection with that. So, I mean, obviously the mystical tradition is very, very key in that. But anyway, that's just an aside. And like my understanding of resurrection and all of this, and my next book is called The Divine Magician, and it comes out in January. And well, what I do in that book is I compare Christianity to a three-part trick, like a magic trick. And a three-part trick, a vanishing trick has a pledge, and a pledge is you have an object, something like this, I don't know, and you're going to make it disappear. So that's the pledge. The second part of the magic trick is the turn, and that's the disappearance of the object. I make it disappear. And the third part is called the prestige, and that's where you bring the object back, right? So if you've seen the film The Prestige by Christopher Nolan, you see it's all connected with this three-part thing. You make a bird disappear, you bring it back. But the trick is you don't bring the bird back in the same way. It's usually a different bird. That first bird is dead, right? You kill the bird, and then the magician brings another bird out, and you think it's the same bird. And the way I read Christianity is Adam and Eve set up the problem. And I wish I could do a psychoanalytic reading of Adam and Eve right now, but very quickly, Adam and Eve are separated from an object. In the separation, they think it's amazing. As soon as you're separated from the object, you can eat of any tree, but not this one tree. They're like, I really want to eat of that tree. I really, really want that tree. And so you have this excessive desire. And what I argue is that the crucifixion, it replicates this very problem. In the Temple of Jerusalem, you have three parts. You have the Holy of Holies, you have then a temple curtain, and then you have the court of Gentiles. And in the crucifixion, so there's the pledge, the Holy of Holies. This is the object. Then there's the turn, which is like the magician's curtain. The curtain is ripped back. The turn is God is not there. Where is God? God is gone. God is dead. But the resurrection is the prestige. It's the return of God. But just like a magic trick, where what returns looks the same but isn't, what I say is in the resurrection, God returns, but not as the object that is sacred, but rather as the depth dimension in all objects, what makes everything sacred. So, so very briefly, sorry about, but this is key, and you've asked a key question. Is for me, resurrection is the revelation of God, not as a sacred object, but as that which is present and makes sacred all objects. And, and that's what I think psychoanalysis does. It kind of, for example, if I think, if I've lost somebody I love and I can't get over it, they're the sacred object. They're the one that kind of whatever. And in psychoanalysis, I have to break that open and in a sense, kind of like find a way of moving forward in life, you know, in a wider way. So in a sense, that's what resurrection is for me, is the church offers up the hope that what Paul Tillich said is that there's a depth dimension to all of life, and that God is not a stranger that we reconnect with. God is the ground of being that we encounter in all of our acts. I don't know if that clarifies my meaning of resurrection.
It does. So you're talking about incarnation, although not incarnation in the particular person of Jesus Christ anymore, but a incarnation that occurs when we experience that through our brokenness in ourselves.
Yes. I mean, in the sense that for me, it's like it's a post-resurrection Jesus is the Jesus who says, where two or three are gathered together in my name, there I am. You know, so it's kind of like with, you know, in church, I suppose it's called the epoch of the Holy Spirit. It's this notion now that God and Christ is found in the activity of breaking bread and communing together.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Tom O'Neill in Charlotte.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, hello. In the preliminaries that we received that had some summary statements, one of them was that you were going to help us reconfigure the practice of faith communities in a way that could help with the disparity between psychotherapy and theology. Could you give us any hints about that? What kind of reconfiguration, what form it might take?
Yeah, no, and this is the controversial bit, you know, and I really, you know, of course I want to kind of convince people that this is a good thing, but it might not be. But what I've spent a lot of my work doing is trying to encourage churches to have music, for example, that is more like what you would hear in a bar or in a coffee shop. You know, like Kierkegaard once said, what is a poet? A poet is someone who screams and cries in agony, but whose lips are so formed that when they cry out, beautiful music is formed. And so when we say to the poet, sing to us again, we are saying, may new disasters befall you. So, you know, what Kierkegaard's saying here is that a good poet, a good singer, is someone who touches the depths of their own suffering, brings it to the surface, and helps other people who are listening encounter their suffering and bring it to the surface. Now, what I want to say is like church can act in two different ways, just like a pub in Ireland can act. So a pub in Ireland can act in two ways. The first is the place you go to get drunk, because life is tough. You've had a hard week, and you just go, you get drunk, you listen to music, you forget your suffering. But the problem is, it comes back the next day. And so you have to go to the pub again and again and again, right? But the other way a pub can operate is it's the place you go to talk about your difficult week. It's the place you go to have a drink. There's not loud music. It's a place you go to unwind and offload stuff. And for me, the church at its worst is like the getting drunk. It's the place you go and all the songs help you escape your brokenness. The sermon tells you everything's going to be okay. And it feels amazing, just like getting drunk. But the next day, because you haven't dealt with the stuff, it comes back. So the church becomes a drug. But the alternative is a church that's more like the Irish pub where you go and you're able to offload. And so the concrete examples would be hymns, not all of them, but some hymns that would talk about suffering and brokenness and doubt and unknowing. some prayers that would say, God, where are you in the midst of this? That would really express doubt and anger and frustration, as well as joy and hope. And sermons where the minister would be able to say things like, you know what, I ask questions too. I have doubts about all of this. A real example that I saw of this was a friend of mine, Vince Anderson, who is a co-pastor of a church in New York. And he got up one Sunday morning, and I was there, first week I was there, and he said, I'm a gospel singer. I believe everything. I believe even the leather on the Bible's genuine. I was like, I believe that I will go to heaven in a chariot, and I will have a white suit, and everything will be great. And then he said, but, recently my father died, and all of that just, poof. He says, it's all just been taken away. He says, I'm full of doubt. I don't know if God's there. I don't know what to do. And I just want to be honest with you as a congregation. And maybe I should step back for a few months. Because to be honest, I'm not telling you that I did have doubts. I'm telling you that I do have them. And I'm not sure what I think. And it was only 20 people in the room, and they all said, what are you talking about? You're our pastor. It doesn't matter. That's wonderful. You're showing that doubt and that unknowing is part of your faith. We want you to stay. And as I witnessed this, I was like, that's what a healthy community looks like. But the problem is, in some churches, I've seen the opposite. In a church in Belfast, the pastor got up and said pretty much the same thing. And he was put on sabbatical. And then when he came back, he didn't have his job anymore. And they brought in somebody else who had all the answers. Now, the weird thing for me, and this is key to my work, is I'm arguing that most people don't believe that the pastor has all the answers. Most people know the pastor probably has doubts. Most people probably know that the pastor has bad relationships with their partner, etc., etc. We just don't want to know that we know it. We don't want to be confronted with it. We want someone to play the game, the emperor's new clothes, because that prevents us from experiencing the trauma of our own doubts. So very concretely, what I really want to encourage churches to do is to actually be honest about that stuff, because it's already there. And I'll give one more example, sorry, and then we can move on. But the example is prayer. Prayer in church is often seen as a way of saying, God, we pray for what's happening in Gaza at the moment. We pray for what's happening in our country, and all of that. And it's a way of expressing deep concern, and that's fine. But if you break up with somebody, for example, and you come to me and you say, oh, that person was really horrible to me, they mistreated me, they went out with somebody behind my back, they really hurt me. I could say to you, no, don't say that. Be nice about them. You've got to understand that it's not all their fault, right? I could say that to you. But actually, I believe you already know that, probably. That you could probably say to me, hold on a second, I know that already. I know that it wasn't all their fault. I know that I was bad to them. I know that I wasn't emotionally available. But let me say all of this so that I can come to know what I already know, so that I can come to the point where I can maybe meet them on the street, shake their hand and say, I'm sorry. So what's required to get to the point where you know what you know is being able to express honestly how you feel. And in the Bible, you have this. In the Psalms, you have these prayers that are angry, that are full of doubt and unknowing and brokenness, as well as joy and hope. And I think that is a model that we need. And again, the traditional church is a little bit more ahead on this because they have a little bit of that already. But I want to encourage a lot more that when you go into the liturgical structure, you hear a hymn that reflects some of your own wrestling, that helps you bring it to the surface and work through it, so that when you leave, you're in a better place than when you went in. Does that help? Do you want to come back on that? Because I think it's a central question.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. You were talking then about the role of the clergy then, and being open, authentic, and yet there's a tightrope the clergy has to walk if you want to keep your job, which implies how a denomination is organized, structured to protect clergy who dare authenticity. I'm in a free church tradition, cooperative Baptist fellowship, so we take the vow of vulnerability when you become a Baptist, because you can get fired and you have no authorities above you to protect you, no buffer zone. Other denominations have some buffer. But I was thinking about that tightrope of authenticity that you were speaking of there.
I honestly, like, I feel so much about that, because, like, I know people who have been fired. I know people who have been, and they've been fired not because they've changed their thinking, but because they've been honest. One example is we run a group I used to call the Omega course, and it's kind of like a bit of a play on the Alpha course, if you've heard of it. It's kind of exiting Christianity in 12 weeks. But it's really exiting toxic religion in 12 weeks. And what we do is, it's similar to the Alpha course. We take 12 theological subjects, we look at them, but we show that there's like multiple ways of looking at them within Christianity. And then we don't kind of sum it up with, and this is the right answer, right? So that's kind of the way it runs. But one week we were doing something on the resurrection of Christ. And during the meeting, one of the women says, I'm not sure if I believe in a literal resurrection, right? And she talks about it, and she says, I've believed in it all my life, but, I'm not too sure. I'm 60 years old. I've just come out of cancer treatment. I've had a lot of time to think, and I'm just not sure. And then somebody else said they did believe that, and they talked about the belief that, something happened that galvanized the disciples. And somebody else said, the bizarre thing is, I've just never thought about it, right? I've said the words, but I don't know what I think. So we had this interesting discussion. But at the end, the woman comes up to me, and I know her, by the way. She's been an elder in her church for maybe 10 years. She's been on the worship team for longer, and she works in the Fair Trade Cafe that's part of the church, where all the money's given to charity. And she says to me, Peter, if I said that in my church, I'd be taken off the eldership, and I'd be taken off the worship team. I'd probably be allowed to work in the coffee shop, but everything else. But, and she says, I've believed it all my life, and I might believe it again in the future. I'm just having questions. And she said, I have to keep that to myself. And so obviously what I asked in response was, is it because you have doubts, or is it because you express them? I.e., do the rest of the eldership team not have those doubts? Would you think that the rest of the eldership team haven't asked that question? And then she went, well, I guess they obviously have. A lot of them have been in it for longer than I have. And so then she said, oh, yes. So it's not about having the doubts. It's about expressing them. That's the fear, right? And so that's the vulnerability. And here's one thing I want to do about this, because so many people, as soon as they express that, they could potentially get fired. So two things. First is that the annoying thing is you have to have the courage to potentially get fired, and it's horrible whenever it's like your livelihood. It's terrible. But two is, I want to do a tour where I go across the country and I ask ministers to, first of all, I ask them, do you have doubts and do you have unknowing? And most of them will say yes. I've been doing this for a long time. Most of them will say yes. And then I'll ask them, and is that part of your faith? Is that part of your faith life? Is that, And again, most of them will probably say yes. But then I'm going to say, okay, come and sign this document that says publicly that you have doubts and unknowing. And we're not going to publish it until we get 2,000 or 3,000 signatures. Because if one person comes out and says that, they get fired. But if 3,000 ministers come out at the same time and say it, you're less likely to get fired. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create a safety blanket where that vulnerability does not necessarily lead to problems.
Question from Nashville. I think, this is Brian Hooper speaking. I think one of the greatest gifts I've ever experienced was my first crisis of faith. And I think I've been through 2 or 3 since then. But I kind of would like to have my cake and eat it too. And while I certainly affirm your critique of what I would refer in my Lutheran tradition as a theology of glory, which we see so much of in this country, and would prefer a theology of the cross, which I think gets into the nitty-gritty, I'm wondering if you have given thought or articulated ways in which a person could hold to an orthodox faith, in other words, affirm the tenets of Nicaea, and at the same time really place the emphasis on this letting go of the needing to be right in order to get into the lived experience of the folks we work with and into our own lived experience, and in that receive the very healing that you're talking about that comes through trusting in this God who gets so vulnerable with us.
Yes, yes. Great. And, very, very briefly, this is why I choose someone like Paul Tillich as my conversation partner. Because, the last thing I want to do is pick Joel Osteen, I go, or Mark Driscoll or something, That's easy. That's just like really, really easy to go, to caricature one side and then beat it. But actually, Paul Tillich is a theologian who not only do I deeply respect, he's so much smarter than me and so much more thoughtful. So, and also Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a Lutheran, isn't he? I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's another one of the theologians who I'm deeply, deeply influenced by. And so while I have like a difference of reading to both of them, like with Tillich, I'm kind of I'm concerned about his reconciliation part, that he kind of feels we can reconcile ourselves. If Tillich and Bonhoeffer, I think, both provide ways of to a certain extent, having a deep sensitivity to this psychotherapeutic method without necessarily going, the direction that I'm going. Funnily enough, mind you, Bonhoeffer was very critical of psychotherapy. If you read Letters and Papers from Prison, he has some brilliant attacks on psychoanalysis, which I think he misunderstands psychoanalysis, but they're very, very good. They're very strong, because he's concerned that we're always trying to make people feel guilty, and he thinks that the therapeutic method is a way of trying to make people feel like they've got a problem, so that then you can offer the solution to it. But in terms of Lutheranism, I would look at Bonhoeffer personally as someone who, the way I read Bonhoeffer is, yes, he kind of almost gets rid of his old work, and he does this radical religionless Christianity, and just before he dies, just before he's executed, he introduces an idea of religionless Christianity. He offers a radically different notion of God. He's talking about how we just have to be purely immanent in the world, and as we serve the world, there we find God. However, a lot of people who are better Bonhoeffer scholars than I am say that no, Bonhoeffer never let go of the other stuff. He just really turned to a much more immanent type of theology of the cross, where he felt that, and he has this beautiful line where he says, to live as though God is not given is to live fully before God and with God. And what I think he means by that is to live as though God is not given as the Deus Ex Machina, the one who fixes everything, the one who makes everything great, is actually the moment that you let go of that, you actually find yourself affirming God. And the move, Paul Tillich describes it brilliantly, where he says, how does Paul Tillich say it? In his 2 types of philosophy of religion, he says that, oh yeah, this is brilliant. He says that if you reject God because of all the suffering in the world, because of all the brokenness, because of all the wars that have been fought in the name of God, because of all the violence that has been done by the church, then you are affirming that life is sacred, that you're affirming that life is good, that life is worth fighting, and therefore you're affirming God, the God beyond God, the God of Christianity, he says. And he says, basically, you're a prophet, because that's what the prophets did. The prophets fought the religion of the day often, like Amos. They fought fought God, even. Some of the old guys like, Jacob fought God, Abraham disagreed with God, all of that for the sake of the city, for the sake of the people. And so Tillich was like, strangely, the very critique of God brings you closer to God. And so he says there's a certain form of atheism that is closer to Christianity than theism. And I think all of that can be integrated into a traditional form of faith. But saying that, I will say, like, my concern that I do retain is my concern is that any time that this a promise is held out that we can be in some way kind of like freed from our anxiety, we are potentially playing with an idolatrous form of God. So I'm very careful on that. That's why I play with a very immanent kind of an immanentist type of Christianity. Yeah, I don't know if that helps at all.
Asked about what he's teaching there.
Another question in Nashville.
The context of war, how his theology was born out of the context of war and all the wars in the world. How does what he's talking about intersect with the context of global war?
Could you hear that at all?
I think so. So it's a question about global conflict, war. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. How does your teaching intersect with
And speak to
global conflict and war?
Okay. Wow. Have we got 3 days? That's a great question. One of the things that I want to draw out actually is, because this is a question that sometimes I get. How does this impact, in terms of a conflict situation, a situation of real violence? But what I want to reaffirm is this theology really grew out of my experience in Belfast, growing up in a conflict. So Northern Ireland, I don't know how much you know about North and South of Ireland, but there was a huge conflict called the Troubles, which was based around the idea of Northern Ireland, whether it should be part of the rest of Ireland or remain part of the United Kingdom. And I grew up during the Troubles. And in many respects, this theology was an attempt to respond to that. So, like, one of the big things is Catholics and Protestants were often at war with each other, because Catholic and Protestant became shibboleths. They became ways of identifying your political allegiance. Now, the truth is, there were Protestants who wanted a united Ireland, and there were Catholics who wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. But Protestant and Catholic became a dividing line. And so what we did is we created a group called ICON. And in ICON, we have this bar. And the idea was, we said, in this space, it's suspended. There's no Jew or Gentile, no slave or free, no male or female, no Catholic or Protestant, no theist or atheist. No, for 1 hour, we performatively kind of let go of those identities and try to encounter each other in a different kind of way. Now, we're also honest that you can't really get rid of your identity in that way. It's almost like a performance, like a theatrical performance. But it was that, and we call that the liturgical space, the space where we all encountered each other beyond our tribal differences. And this theology that I'm trying to explore, then I think really began to help heal those divides. It created a space where those tribal identities were cracked, where the other person could be talked to and, could be an instrument of your further conversion. And so I think that this does have something to offer when any conflict situation, any war situation, because it's a theology that actually grew out of that environment. I don't know if you'd like me to talk more about that or not, but I'm struggling to think of a good example.
No, thank you for that.
This is Jim Pruitt from Charlotte. Peter, you began this by talking about psychoanalysis and using Tillich to critique it. Where the money is being spent in the marketplace now is with certain techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy, brief therapy, even therapies that would put you in front of a computer for 7 weeks to see if you can respond appropriately to CBT methods. When I think of that, I remember a deceased diplomate in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors and Union analyst, John Sanford, in his book, The Kingdom Within, spoke of how the church tends to be married to extroverted religion. Psychology seems to dismiss anything about the soul, and medicine tends to anesthetize the soul. But in the marketplace, the soul is not being addressed in the healthcare systems across the United States, and I'm thinking internationally as well. I'd like your thought about what happens to the soul in psychotherapy and how do we engage that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you know, I don't know how many of you, if you're listening, you know, engage in kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy and whatever, but you know, as a rule of thumb, you know, so I use the term depth psychology, or Paul Tillich uses the term depth psychology to describe any therapeutic method that attempts to tarry with and take into consideration the unconscious, the soul, that which is not directly experienced by the conscious ego. For me, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, they're not depth psychology. They don't engage with the unconscious, and so I'm very much, you know, I'm in the school of the Freud, Jung, Lacan. I'm psychoanalytic in my approach, because for me, what Tillich says is psychotherapy in its best is a protest, he calls it, to all consciousness movements, which is basically any movement that says, you know, I am the master of my own being. My consciousness is the seat of all power. That I am self-transparent. I am transparent to myself. And so for Paul Tillich, he would probably be, you know, not again. I mean, I have friends who do cognitive behavioral therapy. There's nothing wrong with those types of therapeutic approaches if you want to overcome certain problems, you know, certain kind of issues that are, you know, what Lacan would call in the imaginary realm. So, you know, if I'm trying to think of an example, but you know, if you're just not, you're not doing very well at work, you want to set more goals or whatever it is, I think it's very useful. But if you want to, I think, get to the heart of wrestling with anxiety, wrestling with the depths of our being, wrestling with the unconscious, then the therapeutic method is required. But that gets very little funding, because it takes a long time to do. It's actually very, very hard to make change at that deep level. And so what gets funded is drugs. I mean, the big thing at the moment is drug use. I mean, antidepressants are huge. And there's research that says if you take antidepressants enough, you actually heighten your risk of suicide, because it depresses your desire. I mean, one of the things people go to psychoanalysis for is because their desire isn't functioning. They don't desire anything. You know, and antidepressants can minimize your desire to the point where you just go, I'm just going to kill myself. You know, I don't have any desire. And psychoanalysis is actually about trying to get you to desire, get your desire moving, get it up and going again in a healthy way. But that research doesn't get out there because it doesn't get funded. Because what's the research that gets funded? The research that gets funded is the research that says, you know, antidepressants are good. Now, again, I'm not against antidepressants as a whole, but I'm against the system that basically only funds cognitive therapies, consciousness therapies, that only funds drug use. And I do think that that although I'm not a Jungian, you know, Jung is a depth psychologist, so Rogers, Jung, Freud, Lacan, all of these are the people who I think they're the ones who I think can help us understand the depth of theology. So I think I'm just reaffirming what I think your concerns are, if I'm right. I'm not sure. Rather than offering any great insight.
Okay, this is Teresa McElwain from Charlotte. I was just reading your new perspective said that you do not see God as the one to whom we escape to, but one whom is here in the midst. And I was just thinking about that thought in relationship to the slavery movement, where a lot of the Negro spirituals came out of the fact that the oppression of the slavery was so intense and incomprehensible for them to deal with. A lot of their songs came from the fact that, hey, I can't deal with this oppression here because it's too great. So one of the spirituals that I'm thinking about said, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my God and be free. So how does this new perspective not take away the hope of persons in that kind of intense situation, of people who feel the oppression even of today, and not use the church as, like you said, a moment of escape, but see the hope is still there if they no longer see that God is the one they can escape to, away from their current oppression? And it's been said a lot of times that the African American church lasts much longer than the Euro church because they are there enjoying, celebrating that escape moment from the reality of the day-to-day oppression.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great question. I mean, so first of all, you know, I would love to look more into this gospel tradition. My friend Vince Anderson, who I mentioned, he's a huge gospel singer. Like, and he does what he calls dirty gospel, which is kind of like gospel, but with this very earthy kind of like element to it. Now, one of the things he said to me, and I don't know too much about this, but he said, you know, what's interesting is a lot of that kind of gospel music. One is it couldn't directly express the idea of, you know, finding freedom here and now, and fighting oppression, because that would have resulted in death. That would have resulted in, you know, if they had too much of that, so you know, it wouldn't have been allowed. And so he says, you know, some of it, it's all there. He was saying some of the songs, there's this sense of which they're talking about the New Jerusalem. They're talking about the next world. But Vince has said to me, but he says, but that's coded. That in the most oppressed situations where you can't directly say, we want this freedom now and here, you know, it's coded in an otherworldly discourse. Now, I don't know if that's totally right. I don't think it's, and I don't think he would say that's across the board, but he would want to say that a lot of this gospel music was actually revolutionary music that had to code itself because the people had no power at all. And so if they said God wants us to have freedom here in this world, God wants us to be able to, you know, to have our own ability to have freedom and liberty and justice, that would have been, as I say, you know, they would have been killed for that. But there is this negative side as well, not necessarily to the gospel music, but to how the type of religion that often grows up in repressed areas. I don't know if this, I think the stats would lead you to think this, but I'd need to look at them, but that in very poor places, the prosperity gospel will probably get more of a foothold. In very oppressed places, the notion of a God who, you know, in the next life, things will be good, you know, that will grow. And that's completely natural. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. For me, that is just an experience we all go through. The more that I'm suffering, the more I want someone to say it's going to be okay. So that's like, and my defense mechanisms come up if someone gets me to try to work through stuff, and that's completely natural. What I want to argue about is that prosperity gospels ultimately are damaging to those communities. And in the same way that a therapist, and Lacan talks about this, is the demand of the analyze and. So my demand if I'm in therapy is make me better, basically, make me happy. Bring back the person who's left me, or tell me why they shouldn't have left me, or whatever. So my demand is kind of like fix me. You fix me, you make me better. And the ethical response of the analyst is to refuse the demand, is to kind of like refuse to do that, to actually get you to do the work, face up to the brokenness, kind of work through it. So in a similar way, for me, the church, the demand of someone who has no money, who has no hope, who's homeless or whatever, is kind of like, fix this, make it better. But in some respects, the church is the place, well, one that can, do some material good to someone who's really like, who is homeless or something, but is also to refuse the demand that, you can be whole and complete and be made better, and instead go, you have to work this through. Interestingly, the critique of religion that Karl Marx brings out in his introduction to Hegel's philosophy of right, people think that Marx was very negative against religion, because he calls it the opiate of the people. But he goes on to say that it's the heart of a heartless nation, the soul of a soulless condition. Right? So he explains, he says, religion gives people who are oppressed a sense of hope. It actually expresses something beautiful and wonderful. But then he says, but it puts imaginary flowers on the chains of our oppression. And so he says you have to get rid of the imaginary flowers so that you see the chains. Not that so you despair, but so that you can break the chains and pick living flowers. So that's his analogy. Imaginary flowers, you take them off, you see the chains, you break the chains so you can pick living flowers. And what I would say in response to that is actually religion at its best is that. So for Marx, religion is the imaginary flowers, right? And that for me is false religion. That we have to actually, sadly, help people look at their suffering in the same way that in AA, the first thing you have to do is say, I am an alcoholic, right? That's for yeah. I'm Pete Rollins, I'm an alcoholic. You admit the problem. So you see the chains. Not so that you despair, but so that you can begin to work to break those chains and pick living flowers. So that's the move. And then all I would say about the gospel music is I think, although I'd like to look at it, that actually the gospel music is a form of coded way of saying that in an environment where directly saying it would have been very dangerous. But I'm not sure.
Hello, Peter.
Hi.
John Rowe in Charlotte.
Hi, Joe.
I really appreciate your approach to re-radicalizing Christianity, which was radical in the beginning.
Yeah.
I keep hearing in between the lines themes that are very congruent with Buddhist spirituality and psychology: non-attachment, acceptance of suffering, honoring nothingness. What is your thought about that?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I have discussed that actually with a few people, including some Buddhists who connect with some of these ideas. What I would say is, I'm going to talk about Westernized Buddhism here because that's generally, the kind of Buddhism that we're aware of here. So Westernized Buddhism, what I'm saying has a similar diagnosis. So in Buddhism that we know, there is a sense that desire is actually part of the problem. It's like that we desire that our desires causes suffering. However, there's a slight difference between what I'm saying, I think, and what I think is in Christianity and what you see in Buddhism. And the difference is this. For me, Christianity is not about letting go of all attachment, but rather a form of attachment. So for me, Christianity is actually a materialist religion, and by that I mean it embraces the material as valuable. You know, for God so loved the world. You know, the Eucharist is bread and wine. There is this sense of, and you know, the idea of love as well. Love is attachment. You know, attachment to people and to things. And so for me, Christianity is very much about desire. It's not about getting rid of desire. It's about desiring. And psychoanalysis is about this as well. It's about helping people desire in a healthy way. What I would say is what the problem is a form of excessive desire, jouissance. It's the desire that causes us to act against our own self-interest. So, you know, I think it was Lacan who talked about an experiment where they had mice and they put them in a cage and they put really good food behind a glass sheet and they put bad food that was freely accessible. The mice bounce against the good glass to try and get the good food, and then they forget it and they go and eat the bad food. Fair enough. Just like any utilitarian, they kind of realize that this will maximize my pleasure and minimize my pain. But then they took the mice out, they played with their brains, they put them back in the cage, and they got the mice so that they kept bouncing against the glass to get the good food, that they'd starved themselves to death. Right? So what they did is they actually got the mice to have an excessive desire that was actually damaging to themselves. So in the Lacanian frame, this desire is human. That we as humans have this, we have excessive attachments that actually act against their own self-interests. For example, you know, Ayn Rand says, well, you know, consumerist capitalism operates purely on our selfishness. So we maximize our pleasure, minimize our pain, and so we have to make that work for everybody or whatever, right? But the Freudian analysis is no, that this excessive pursuit of wealth is not selfish. It's a form of selflessness, but it's a form of perverse selflessness, like a zombie. You know, a zombie goes for somebody, and even if you shoot them, they keep coming at you to their own detriment. So you find that people who are pursuing wealth, some of them, if they were selfish, they would stop when they'd made 10 million or 20 million or 30 million. I've met people who have made hundreds of millions of dollars, but who cannot stop themselves. If they were happy, if they were in their own self-interest, they would stop and enjoy it. You know, they'd stop when they made their 50 million or 100 million, and they'd party. But they keep going to the detriment of their relationships, to the detriment of their health, to the detriment of their well-being. And then it's their kids who go out and spend it all, right? That is this excessive jouissance. And again, therapy, that's the bread and butter of therapy, where someone goes and says, why am I always attracted to people who hurt me? You know, why am I doing something, attracted to something that is against my own self-interest? Right? So, okay, so I lose myself. You were asking, Buddhism, sorry. I'm getting old. This brain is not working as well as it used to. That's what I think is the problem, is that excessive desire which is destructive, not all desire. And actually, when we get rid of that negative desire, we can desire in a much healthier way. And I think that's what Christianity asks us to do, to enter more fully into the world. But where it's close to Buddhism, I think is in its similar understanding that there's a certain form of desire that is deeply damaging to the human self.
Good afternoon, Dr. Rollins.
Hi.
This is Joanna Flemister from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm at Carolina's Health Systems. I'm part of the Emerging Professional Scholars and in this integrated psychotherapy program. My question today is, you mentioned 3 forms of anxiety. Death was the third one. I'm just wondering, what are your views on life after death and the hope that Christians have when facing death?
Yeah. So my main concern with life after death, or the question of life after death, is only when that becomes a way of escaping life before death. So, that's a comment that I often make, is that for Christianity is not primarily a question of life after death. It's a question of whether is life possible before we die. And what I mean by that is, I think in general, the concepts of life and death in the Bible are existential. Now, I don't mean exclusively so, but I would say that predominantly, when the terms life and death are used, they're used to describe a modality of life. So, for example, when Jesus comes and says, I have come to bring life, and life in all its fullness, he's not talking to the literal dead. Right? He's not talking to the people in graveyards. He's talking to people who are alive, but who experience life as a form of death, right? A death in life. And when he says, let the dead bury their dead, there's two ways of using dead there. The first is an existential form of death, which is the living who live in a form of death. And then the second is the literal dead. Let the dead bury the dead. And what I'm interested in is there's two types of death that I would argue. Ultimately, there's biological death, and then there is also a form of death in life. And the death in life is the first one for me. That's what Christianity is offering. And so I would argue that even concepts like eternal life and salvation begin here. They're not about the continuation of life along, forever. Now, they might as well, but they're primarily about a transformation in the modality of life. Now, the way I think about it is using Nietzsche. There's the old wisdom of Silencius that Nietzsche brings up, where a king captures this demon and says, what is the secret of happiness? And the demon says, to never have been born. And the second, if you can't get that, the second is to die young, right? So it's kind of very depressing. But the idea is this: if I had a gift and I could touch you right now in the head and I could let you live forever, but I couldn't help you enjoy and experience the depth of your life, I wouldn't be a god, I'd be a devil. If salvation was simply the continuation of life, that would be a curse. I mean, heaven would be just full of people screaming to die. That would be the vision of heaven. Heaven would be hell. What I need to be able to do, and medical people can do that. Medical people will be able to extend life, and potentially extend life in ways that we can't even imagine. But they can't give you a depth to life. For me, fundamentally, Christianity and salvation, eternal life, is about an infinite depth to existence that transforms how you exist. Now, once you have that, the question of the longevity of that, that could exist for eternity, or maybe that ends at a certain point. But it's like that. The reason why I avoid the question of life after death until I've said that is because I want to say that longevity does not give life meaning. So eternity and eternal life and salvation is not about longevity, even if it includes longevity. It's about depth and transforming our modality of life. And so in my last two books, what I've been really interested in, it's very key, because people talk about salvation and eternal life. But then you go, like, what does that look like? What does it actually look like? Like, honestly, what does it look like? And this is where psychotherapy, I think, is key. Because I think psychotherapy can give us a hint as to what it looks like. And so I've tried to argue that salvation is the experience of the loss of the idol that helps me try to escape life, but actually just creates symptoms of destructive symptoms, that helps me embrace the depth of life and helps me embrace my anxiety. So I could be wrong, but what I want to literally do is say, the question of salvation is not some sort of like abstract thing of just like, oh yeah, I'm going to live forever. It's actually a different way in which I'm going to live right now. And then the question for theology is, well, okay, well, tell me what that looks like. What's the good news? And I think psychotherapeutic models can actually help the church understand what real salvation, what real life before death looks like.
I just want to thank you, Peter, for your time today. I really appreciate your thoughts, and I'm glad that you could join us. I appreciate those in North Carolina. Thanks for the great questions. It's about time for us to wrap up here and move to our conversations in our local areas. But I just wanted to thank you. I don't know if you can hear all the applause. That is applause.
Thank you.
Charlotte as well, thanks you, Rick. Peter, we thank you in Charlotte so much.
Thank you. I thought that was like feedback, so that's very nice. Very appreciate the applause. Like, what's going on? By the way, just let me say that I'm very happy to continue these conversations with any of you who are listening to this, either in person or on email or Facebook. This is key to me. I mean, I genuinely believe that the psychotherapeutic method can revolutionize how the church looks in the 21st century. And so if any of you want to continue these conversations, I'm very happy to try to create space for that to happen, to take a phone call or whatever. So I just want you to know that you know, I want to, you know, this is not just me signing off after like an hour of speaking, but if you want me to continue to be a dialogue partner in some way, you know, we can make that happen. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Bye.
So as we now engage our panel, we're going to ask in this order, Dr. Rowe, Dr. Roddy, and Tom O'Neill to give their reflections on Peter Rollins' presentation, our questions, their questions as well. And as they've had a chance to do that and engage each other for a bit, then we'll be opening it up for your questions to the panel. So we'll begin with Dr. John Rowe. John?
Yeah, thank you. Well, Peter Rollins stirs a lot of thought and makes a lot of sense, particularly from a psychotherapeutic perspective. It made me think, though, about 17 years ago when I started a counseling service at Davidson United Methodist Church, a large Methodist church in North Mecklenburg. I got some really interesting responses from people in the congregation. They didn't really understand what a pastoral counseling center under the umbrella of a church was for. There was concern that their church didn't have that many problems that would require psychotherapy, and they worried that I would be underutilized, which was far from the case. Within 2 weeks, my caseload was full. So Rollins makes me think about the skepticism that is out there in our congregations about what's going on in pastoral counseling. How does that fit with the doctrinal position of the church, the orthodox positions of the church, the overall life of the congregation, when people are basically telling secrets behind closed doors that no one else has privy to. And then several years after being at Davidson, the rumor started that if you were married and you went to Davidson Methodist Church's Counseling Center for counseling, you would end up being divorced. That was the vicious rumor, and as far as I could tell, there was no truth to it, though there were a lot of young couples, 20-year marriages, that the marriages were coming apart. So when I think about the challenge of Rollins to blend principles of psychotherapy with the practice of congregations, I'm not sure I have much hope. It feels like an uphill battle.
Were they able to eventually see coming and telling you the secrets, sort of a reenactment of their old confessional that is more of out of the Catholic tradition? Because it's there, you know, the confessional. You became the priest.
Well, the vote is out. Some people are, because we have half of our clients are from the church, and it's not unusual for clients to know other clients when they walk into the waiting room and recognize them. So there's a certain acceptance among part of the congregation, but the pastor usually, because people ask for it, when he makes referrals, he gives people several names, not just the names of people at the counseling center, because there are those who are afraid to be seen walking in the counseling center's door. So there's that kind of split of what happens in the congregation and the healing that often happens for people outside of the congregation.
Does the pastor understand the type of psychotherapy that you do?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there a parallel with some of the liturgical elements in the worship and in the church, sort of dealing with that tension and that ambiguity of not knowing the answers or sitting with the suffering?
Well, I think our pastor is relatively progressive. He walks a thin line. For example, a young woman in her teens, 16 years old, who wants to explore her sexual identity can do that openly in the counseling center, but that would never be talked about within the context of worship. Of worship being a place where people can explore who they are, explore their doubts, those kinds of deep questions that are relatively taboo. So the only other comment I wanted to make, and then we'll shift to whoever's next, is where I disagreed with Rollins. He makes a big deal out of the search for wholeness and authenticity. And I think a lot of what he says is right, but I want to argue for a form of wholeness that is not about reaching one's highest self and living out of that in some sort of state of perpetual nirvana, but a sense of wholeness that is not about symbiosis or merger with some higher self, but about acceptance of multiplicity and acceptance of brokenness, acceptance that we all have these infantile parts of us that look for union and merger, and yet the importance of grieving, consciously grieving, that this is something that as human beings we all deal with. I've had some interesting cases in the past few years of very confident professional adults who have had multiple failed relationships, learning that the real issue for them is the infantile wound that says, I can have what I want. And in pursuing that wound, they also get all the psychotic, kind of insane kinds of things that happen in exciting relationships that also have a huge side of abandonment and destructiveness.
Okay, Jim, I appreciated your question to him about cognitive behavioral therapy and brief therapy, because although there's so much I appreciate about his theology and philosophy, one thing I struggle with, and may reflects also my journey, which is far from over as a pastoral psychotherapist, is my background, my training was in object relations and family systems as the primary modalities. And then what I have picked up since then through various training opportunities that are more cognitive behavioral oriented or brief therapy or mindfulness and EMDR, although I'm not certified in that and very much just learning, a novice with that. And my struggle has been, I think object relations and psychoanalytic theory is really wonderful to have as something undergirding what you're doing. And also if you have clients who can do long time work and are invested in that, and people with personality disorders and so forth. But a lot of my clients come and they are, for reasons of money or time, are not able to do that type of long-term work. And I see, though, part of what CBT provides and mindfulness-based therapies provides, is learning how to tolerate the separation. That a person may be struggling with, the alienation, the estrangement, that is coming out in terms of their anxiety or in terms of their impulsive relationships with others. Or that may be coming out in terms of the way the continual negative thoughts or compulsive thoughts. And so I have come from seeing that. I used to see CBT. I had a very split view of psychoanalytic thought and CBT, which I think is a false dualism, because I see the CBT as beyond just trying to fix something with quick answers, but trying to help a person tolerate anxiety and separation that are there for all kinds of meanings, but to be able to reframe them in a way so that they can function in their life. And that in of itself has huge value, because if they can function in their life, then they can possibly move towards wholeness in some relationships. The mindfulness I really like in terms of thinking about how to be in that separation, how to be in that space that seems overwhelming and seems to hold nothingness, and that one continually fills with different things. And that is, perhaps some of these are a way of thinking about transitional objects that are used in a therapeutic setting. Perhaps some of them are ways of thinking about grace and how do we internalize grace even through the way we change our thinking. So there's many different usages of these, but I guess, and then the other thing I would add to that is what I do find is, and I wanted to ask him about this, is what he is presenting is, in terms of mind-body, it's dualistic. There are many therapies, as I'm sure you are aware, some particularly well-known, such as eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, that are really looking at the way trauma impacts our systems, our ways of thinking, even neurologically, and of doing physical things to help bridge the different areas of our brain, the cortex and the limbic and the more reptilian parts. And that, again, I don't quite know where that, I see that as a really valuable way that people can work through trauma. But I find that what he is saying is rather dualistic in terms of understanding the effect of trauma or the effect of separation on the mind and on the body. So I just throw those out. Those are just some of my thoughts.
My brain is tired.
Which part?
You're retired, so you can deal with it.
Yeah.
I wanted to respond to the question that Susan's raising, because obviously CBT is extremely effective and extremely helpful. I think, though, it's helpful at the level of strengthening people's egos. When people are dealing with lots of shame, guilt, negative thinking, they don't need to let go of stuff, and they don't need to go into the depths, because that would just create more fragmentation and more shame. They need stronger egos, and I don't know that he really addressed addresses this dynamic. But he said he's Jungian, or he likes Jung, and Jung would say you always have to have a firm grounding in your ego in order to do soul work, or otherwise people are in real danger of psychosis. If we push
Right.
them too fast to use an object relations model.
Which is why dialectical behavioral therapy is so helpful with people with borderline personality disorder.
Yeah.
In addition to dealing, or as also you're dealing with the whole separation and attachment issues.
Yeah.
Back to one thing you were talking about, Susan, about the biology, the brain, the body. You will get an email, if you gave us your email, that has an attachment on it that advertises the regional conference of the American Southeast Region in October 24th through 26th at Canoga near Hendersonville. Dr. James Griffin is going to be there to talk about big title, Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy and Neuroscience, Spiritual Experience, Biology, and Clinical Applications. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. This will be attached to your email.
And Tom, another commercial is those of you who are students, emerging professionals and scholars, you're in a degree program, you can go to the website www.aapc.org. That's www.aapc.org. You're eligible to be a student member. Those of you who are perhaps therapists or from other types and stripes, there's a general membership category that you can find out about at the same area of the website. You go to membership and it tells you everything you want to know. It also details the certification levels with the American Association of Pastoral Counselors. So thanks for making that commercial for us, Tom.
I'd like to move toward the more, the larger picture. Y'all have been dealing with clients, but dealing with the systems of church, denominations, and what I think our field of psychotherapy, which would include family systems and other modalities, the contributions that I see that they are making toward churches in general. I've worked for about 10 years at the Davidson Clergy Center, and that has entailed work with around 300 plus clergy who have come in for a week-long intensive to deal with having been fired, on sabbatical, other reasons, burnout, and they are in this 1 week intensive, and it's a rather a market plunge for them. And in my working with the 300 plus, there are several things that have sort of dropped out as I was thinking about this conference of how are we a bridge, our whole discipline, a bridge to the church. We bridge to the medical community in ways of which Jim's trying to do with the integrated psychotherapy program, the bridge with the medical community. How do we bridge back to the church? For many of us in the pastoral counseling movement, we're at odds, have been at odds with the congregations and churches. And how do you stay in a system? How do you embed yourself there, change it over time? Change takes time. And I came up with several, permit me, what do we have, like 5 minutes here? Or then let me give you some of the observations of what I think what we understand about, say, for congregations. And you'll recognize this as not original, but Friedman stuff. For congregations, there are pills and there are plums, and 99 varieties in between. There are churches that honor their leaders, there are churches that eat up their leaders. And it's helpful to know that one from the other. 2, antagonists do exist. You are not paranoid when they are against you, and they always inflate their numbers. 3, some congregations need to die or declare themselves bankrupt spiritually and or financially. In other words, if you take Corinthians 13, they are out of love, bankrupt. 4, like motivated people, plums grow despite evidence to the contrary. They have resiliency and are thrivers. Some congregations need the old benevolent bull elephants or mama elephants around to keep people in order and respect for the shadow in a group. Individuals will do things that are very good and very bad. Groups can do the same thing, but at an amplified pace. That's congregation. Judicatories, which means the overarching bodies. Presbyterians have the Presbytery, y'all have the Methodist Conference, Episcopal Church, Baptist, we have no judicatory. Structure does matter, first. Triangles exist here as well. The triangle between the judicatory, the pastor, the congregation. Who are you serving? Oh, God. Yeah, God's the fourth part of that. 2, chaos tolerance has determined the level of top-down control. When a group cannot tolerate chaos, they clamp down. They have structure. They have rules. The book of order, whatever. It serves a purpose to keep the corporate anxiety from getting too high. The free church structures will resource themselves, which they are, Baptists are. Bishopric churches will increasingly do also outside of their defined channels. So you see this whole challenge of denominations is changing across the board. Seminary education, third group. There's no way to teach all one needs to know in seminary. 2, experiential education is essential for those who've had clinical pastoral education or other field experiences where there's this high interaction. That's necessary. 3, the laity need to know the clerical secrets. The laity need to know the clerical secrets. The kinds of education we get sometime, we don't dare put it out in the congregation. Maybe rightly so, but are you familiar with Coursera? C-O-U-R-S-E-R-A. It's an app where you can go and you can take courses from MIT, Stanford, Harvard. You can take the course, you don't get the credit. But there needs to be a Coursera for theological education so laity can tap into what seminary professors are teaching to understand it, what the pastor's gone through. Fourthly, the whole area of theology. The dominant theological paradigm will continue until the stories and conclusions are no longer effective or believable by the dominant groups within a church or outside religious life. And the one that so often he didn't comment on, but any of the atonement theories are really being challenged these days, challenged in my own mind, are eschatological beliefs, or evolution. South Carolina this past week agreed that the evolution was not just a theory, or gender issues. So that's from the larger systemic view. Peter Rollins' stuff has helped me to think through some about, what is it we're about? What is realistic hope? What shape will it take? I'm sort of a pragmatist, and back to what you said about optimism and pessimism, I remember the line that says, I'm an optimist in spite of all the evidence against it. So that's some of the gleanings I've had from working with clergy in larger systems. If there's any questions you have about that or responses, I'd be glad to.
If I could stir in one other piece when we talk about systems. The healthcare systems are deciding that we can no longer provide the kinds of individual therapy for people. Our agenda now needs to be patient populations. How do we do that, while at the same time responding to frequent flyers to the emergency department, persons who are frequent criers to the physician's time? And so many of the systems, healthcare systems, are bringing in persons who specialize in patient population. They're looking into things such as acupuncture and healing touch and other modalities that can be used in a group setting to cut the costs down. So that raises other kinds of dynamics. Where do those who practice particularly depth psychotherapy fit into this delivery system? And how do we become champions of the whole continuum of care? Another hospital system in this state, the Wake Forest Medical Center, its CareNet program, for example, they've developed something called Faith Health. Their belief is that we will not be able to deal with the mental health concerns of the populace unless the church is involved. So this conversation is timely. Persons such as Dr. Ken Carter, who's an emergency room physician here and previous president for NADA. There's an ear acupuncture method, for example, that involves 5 places in the ear that can deal with all kinds of addictions, craving, et cetera, and he advocates we can teach lay people to do this, and we can do this in groups of 25. And what it then helps us to be able to do is to address those kinds of issues there and develop a continuum of care. So I'm just stirring this into the bigger picture of the systems. We did have one of our EPS folks that wanted to ask a question previously, and I want to present it to him to raise his question as we get this started. Coming back toward you.
Yeah, this is John Adriatico. What I saw was, in listening to him, I saw object theory, I saw attachment, insecure, and secure attachments, and what I saw is that with insecure attachments, we're seeing that someone's looking for self-soothing, and that they're not able to get that, so what they're doing is they're attaching to different types of objects, people, anything, to basically try to self-soothe. And then essentially what happens is that even though they may be secure, they still are lacking, because they're still searching for, and this goes back to Larry Crabb, they're still searching for perfectionism, and they're searching for security and significance. My question really comes down to is that by looking at the mind, body, and spirit, we really still need to look at the neurological imbalances and make sure that we look at that too, because you can do all of the cognitive therapy, but if the person still is not wired properly, you still need the medication to go ahead and help them to be able to balance. I guess my question to all of you is that something that makes sense, or can the therapy still work that out?
I think that was something I was trying to get at. I do believe in an integrative approach like that. And there are some clients who are so anxious that they can't sit still in the room.
Yeah.
It's just awful to watch. And I can't do anything much else with them until they get some sort of medication in order to be able to simply even listen and engage in therapy. And that was with the EMDR, to me, that's a neurological intervention into the way people process trauma. And so I feel like that those are vital interventions that are needed that can be misused and abused. Mm-hmm. It's easy to just want to medicate. Well, most of us do not want to medicate everybody.
Right.
But at times it can be used as a quick answer, and it can then, as he would say, dull the desire to maybe stay in the struggle and in the anxiety. It would dull the desire to move forward and get better. And that's a complex thing, but I don't know, I don't want to monopolize.
When you're doing EMDR and you're pushing the thoughts out, the question still is, isn't there still a void of a chemical imbalance?
Of course, in my opinion. Part of the struggle here is financial. People may be able to afford symptom relief,
Right.
which would include things like CBT and antidepressants, anti-anxiety, mood stabilizers, for a relatively short time, say 3 to 6 months, maybe a year. But they can't afford the kind of therapy that would create intrapsychic change. So I think that's, to me, part of the mission of the church is to provide things like client scholarship for people who want to do soul work, and they don't want to just be accommodating to whatever. And I think the church has an ethical responsibility to do that. These drugs, as far as I understand, were not designed for long-term use. They were designed to help people through a short time, relatively speaking, 1 to 3 years, while they are developing new coping mechanisms. And I've seen a lot of clients who come in often over-medicated. Their psychiatrists are just trying to do the best they can in 15 minutes without the benefit of psychotherapy. And in collaborating with the psychiatrists, they're often willing to titrate down the medications, reduce the medications, so then the client can do the intrapsychic work that enables them to eventually get off the medications or extremely reduce it.
I would say that if you have something like bipolar disorder, you usually need a long-term intervention with drugs. I don't know, maintenance with drugs.
Can I just raise a question? My name is Gary Kling. I'm a practicing psychotherapist in Greensboro, North Carolina. It seems that we're talking about the difference between treatment modalities when you're talking about CBT and other treatment modes, and deeper levels of acceptance and integration. John, you were talking a little bit about that short-term treatment as opposed to what I think Rollins is talking more about. I treat a number of folks who, using a variety of different modalities, but I also have to face the fact that they go back to a church and a community oftentimes that undermines the very things that they're hearing in their counseling. And so there is a tension set up within that person as to whether or not that the treatment is really going to take. So I can have folks come in who will do, I'm also with an EAP program at one of the local hospitals. I have people who come in and can go through 6 to 7 sessions, learning about how to do EMDR or something like that, but they go back into a church community that completely undermines that. And so I think that's some of what I'm hearing Rollins talk about or try to address, as to how the sickness might not be just in the person, the sickness might be in the community, in the theology that the community embraces. Is that sort of what you're saying? Or anybody want to
What makes you wonder then why that person stays in that community then?
Sure.
The danger you run into is if you're dependent on that church community to provide support, and then the person you're treating decides they're going to leave that church, and then the pastor says, well, it's not supposed to happen that way. Of course, a lot of those pastors wouldn't be giving you money anyway, support, but the churches have a shadow too. You know, how will this person stay in this group and find a healthier attachment to this group, or say, I am different than these people. Belonging is such a powerful thing, and to change is very difficult, but sometimes necessary. Question there, Jim.
Do you find the churches are very, let's just say, they would prefer to handle it within more of a social environment versus more of a therapy environment, in a sense that, you know, we've heard about the Celebrate Recovery programs and that. I guess the question is that, is it more of a social, you know, let's all get together and talk about it in a group environment?
Small groups, yeah.
Yeah, versus more one-on-one counseling or a counseling type group?
I think that really depends on the denomination. I certainly have experienced as a Presbyterian who was director of a Presbyterian counseling center in town, that it received a lot of support. That the Presbyterian churches, matter of fact, got together to form it, and so was very supportive of the individual counseling model. I think there are, in other churches, I think that tend to be more, have less toleration for ambiguity, perhaps, are more suspicious of the culture, that they often may be more suspicious of you unless you are of a certain, if you are a Christian counselor versus a pastoral counselor, then if there's a set of counselors, and I mean, I'm not critiquing them, I have a set of counselors I would refer to or not. But I do think there's a greater suspicion of the culture.
Yeah, I'm thinking that it's a both and. When congregations see people who have gone into individual therapy broken and pretty lost and not contributing to the community or the church or the families, but maybe after 1 or 2 years of therapy, they see a changed person, they're willing to make contributions to a client scholarship fund because they see that it's not just in the client's self-interest, but it's in the interest of the congregation. That have people have renewed lives and you know, find a part within the social fabric. And that takes time, and that takes constant work at educating congregations, being visible. We have to, you know, we're trained as pastoral counselors to operate in secrecy, or relatively secrecy. I think we have to stretch ourselves. I have to stretch myself because my introvert doesn't want to do that. But I think that's part of the challenge, is to let churches know what we offer.
Here's an interesting interaction with the church that I am having right now, although they don't know that I'm having it. But I have a woman who has borderline personality disorder, is in her, I guess, about 60, and suffered horrible abuse growing up. And she has been, well, I've just been seeing her since April. She's been up and down and up and down, and when I went on vacation, ended up in the hospital, and she's right now on an up. And she attends a conservative church. And on this up, she's coming in with very language that I'm not, that I don't use, but I'm not judging it. But like God is my warrior, and this and God's glory, and it's such a up with it. I think that's what gets me. And she went and talked to her pastor. Now, she's been up a week, and you know, there's definitely mood disorder components. She went and talked to her pastor. She's been out of the hospital a week and I guess 2 weeks, and one of these weeks she's been on an up. She went to talk to her pastor, and this pastor immediately said, well, you have to give a testimony in front of the congregation. Now, I'm sitting here going, because because but I can't, I can't control that, and you know, God's spirit is involved here, so I don't know what will come of that. But to me, it is a setup for the mania she's in. But I'm dealing with the church culture that I am not, is not one that I have felt or grown up being engaged with in that way. And a system and a way of seeing things that's very different from the way I see things going on. And so having to interact between the two, which is really my acceptance of her and non-judgment, because who am I to judge? But it's interesting, that clash that goes on sometimes, and the clash is usually just in my mind, but having a very different perhaps theology and conceptualization of things, and then the person goes to their theological system and then comes back in, and that whole piece that adds to the relationship.
I was just wanting to comment again from the different cultural standpoint. It seems like within the African American culture, the different types of church changes based on the socioeconomic level. There are churches in town where a lot of the people goes because they're doctors and lawyers, and they say, I want to be around people in my churches that make this kind of money, and this church has a certain standard, and they are wonderful big churches, and they embrace psychotherapy. They have counseling centers in the church, and the pastor is well educated with a doctorate and everything, and it's moving into the circle of embracing the care of the whole person. But then you have so many of those smaller, medium-sized churches where it's not required in that denomination that the pastor have any kind of theological training. And they believe from the evangelical Pentecostal movement, you know, when the Spirit of God comes, it endows you with everything. You don't need any kind of training. So I was in both worlds. I was raised up in the United Methodist Church. Then when I got married, I became in the AME Zion Church. It's in that time and space that I received my call to ministry, and when encouraged to go and get my Master of Divinity because I was interested in corrections chaplaincy. Then my husband was pastoring as well. But in the meantime, because that denomination at that time did not embrace husband and wife clergy, we had to come to a point of saying we need another space that would embrace us both. And this was back in the 80s, so we moved more out of the mainline Methodism into non-denominational, where most of those churches are smaller and don't require any kind of theological training. So here I am in a situation where I got the training coming from this background, but now I'm in this setting. So part of my sense of purpose for moving from chaplaincy to becoming a pastor counselor was getting back into the community to try to help educate the smaller churches and the medium-sized churches the importance of embracing, but it has been an uphill battle, a very uphill battle, because most of those pastors are not required to have any theological training. And they see we got the altar, we lay on hands, we use the oil, and we, you know, God is our deliverer. So again, how do we still find creative ways to try to infiltrate that mindset and to integrate the holistic approach from the churches, pastors who don't have any really theological training and see that's important? Let's know, talking about coming to psychotherapy. I just want to know if there's some ideas that you all may have had to help me keep addressing this, because this has been my battle for a while.
And to do it as a female, too.
Yes, that's another nuance that I didn't put into the picture. So you don't just have the big churches, but the educational level and the socioeconomic and the size of the church. So you got all those tiers, especially from an Afrocentric standpoint, culture that you're dealing with, and trying to encourage them to come into embracing psychotherapy.
It reminds me, Teresa, of what Rollins was saying, that it's risky to try to have a foot in the psychotherapeutic world and in the traditional structures of the church. My thought about that is none of us should do this kind of thing alone, because you can lose your job, or you can lose support, you can lose funding, you can lose friends. So it's really important to have a support network. That's my thought.
Can I suggest education for clergy that you're talking about? We've been really successful with lunch and learns. Okay. Presenting, asking churches to allow us to meet, and then sending out invitations to ministers. I do pastoral care specialist training, put it out there that these are skills that most of us are not learning anymore. Clinical pastoral education skills, a lot of them are not being taught in seminaries now. And so offering that to help pastors with their pastoral care skills. And most pastors will go for that, who are in Christ, and will come. And we have a group of about 10 to 13 that meet on a monthly basis. But I think that is really, I've been surprised by the amount of support for that among the pastors when we offer that.
So lunch and learns that lead to pastoral care specialist training and other things like that can be useful. I'm mentioning this for the recording so that we make sure. George Canella is an EPS, soon to become an LPC, and George has a comment question.
So how can a counselor be supportive of a client when the goal of the church culture may be different from what the client feels is best? And you're working kind of within the church culture as well.
Can you give an example of a goal that you're thinking of?
Well,
that they might have that would be...
Well, Dr. Rowe talked about how adolescent client may be interested in exploring their sexuality, and in the counseling session that can be talked about, but given in fellowship that would not be, and there would be a certain set of standards expected. So just wondering, maybe with that example, how could a counselor working in that sort of setting where there's a church culture that may have a different set of values, perspectives?
Well, I would see that as, well, first of all, I have to remember that the person I'm working with is my client and not the church. And then I suspect if the church culture doesn't support some of the client's goals, that at least a significant part maybe of the larger culture doesn't support either. Although, for example, if you're talking about gender issues, there's a growing number of churches who are more inclusive. But I would think that part of the therapy is helping the client tolerate that anxiety and begin to learn where he or she wants to negotiate it. Where he or she wants to take a step forward, or if not, then how to tolerate being at that place as one place along the journey that she or he is in. Do you have?
Yes. Yeah, I would add that I think the way I think about therapy, I have a responsibility to help the client find support outside of therapy. I don't want to be the person's only support person, particularly when they come from a faith tradition that does not support the goals they're working on. So I will ask them, is there anybody else in your congregation that you could trust to talk about? You know, something I kept thinking about during Rollins' talk was there is the church visible, but there's also the invisible church. There is often within the bounds of our congregations an invisible church that's made up of people with doubts, questions, brokenness. They may not talk out loud in the public gatherings, but they meet privately with one or two or three others. In a particular example I shared, this 16-year-old's mother was from a very fundamentalist congregation, but she knew that she was not able to help her daughter with what she needed. So she brought her daughter to a liberal counseling center.
I think what's being mentioned here is that often the clients who come to see us are a representation, if not a remnant, of the shadow side of the congregations that they attend. One of the difficulties, it seems to me, in simply doing CBT work, even when you inflate the ego and the persona that covers it, is that often the shadow gets submerged further. And I think that's part of what I'm hearing when clients are trying to engage the shadow part of their own formation. The church tends to want to manage it by putting a covering over it, have you come in alignment with our persona. But where church breakthrough occurs is when the church itself faces its own shadow side. Now, we've talked about our clients coming, and I want to pull the table differently because we've got a number of new people in the field. In 1976, John Patton presented 57 theses about pastoral counselors. One of those is that pastoral counselors will always be embarrassed by their church and always an embarrassment to their church. This very shadow theme that we're talking about. What do you recommend yourselves in your own journey to find peace between the congregational life that you have and the professional life as a pastoral psychotherapist? How do you get your own refuge, and what can you communicate to new therapists in the field about finding that place of resource to continue to hold the gap between the established church, often the local church, and the client's deeper issues? What do you do to help yourself?
I think that what's been helpful is to have a subversive group at church who sort of march to their own drumbeat, and within the structure, like a Sunday school class of people who've been together 25, 28 years. Some of us aging out, but nevertheless, people coming and going. But it's a place to explore. We've been playing some of Rollins' tapes from YouTube, Brian McLaurin's. The next book will be Thank God for Evolution by Michael Dowd, who is a UCC minister, who is a evolution evangelist. He and his wife traveling around the country trying to talk about this, what he calls creatheism. Creatheism, in other words, this universe has been here 14 billion years. God has been active in the whole thing and still is. Now, how do we make sense of that? Michael Dowd, Thank God for Evolution. If you haven't read it, go for it. Continue to read myself and try to be challenged. Stay on some kind of cutting edge. Otherwise, I get bored. Colleagues, I have not worked in a center where I was by myself, which has helped a lot to have colleagues where we can have these come to Jesus meetings every now and then in the hallway.
I'd be interested in others' response to this question. I'm answering as a middle son. So I have lots of experience of straddling two sides of things, trying to figure out what the rules are versus finding my own place, usually against the ones who want to establish the rules. So for me, it's been a fairly comfortable thing to try to respond to the hierarchy of the congregation and the church by remembering that they may not look like they have a shadow, but they do. and they may not talk about their shadow, but if I can at the same time try to get money from them for my counseling program, and also speak to their concerns for how do they address the shadow needs in their congregation, I've tended to be fairly successful at that. Not without some stress.
Well, you knew a lot of secrets on a lot of people, and they knew it.
Well, yes. I used to have to go to the Staff Parish Relations Committee every year, and I finally got them to stop that because I knew too much about them.
That's a good question. I guess for me, what I have struggled the most with is the issue of legitimacy. In terms of when I speak to people and tell them what I do, that I'm a pastoral counselor, there is suspicion. You know, sometimes the suspicion is, do I, you know, read the Bible to them and proof text everything I say? A lot of people just don't know what it is or don't feel like I have the adequate education, the right education, although I have plenty of education. And I think that's it. And then it's integrated with I think, my own personal self and fears. But I guess what has helped me with that over time, there's one other aspect of it, is that I am a certified North Carolina fee-based pastoral counselor, but I do not have an LPC. And so that also, in the eyes of insurance companies and so forth, I'm welcome with some, but not others. And so that also brings up the question of legitimacy. And I think that what has helped me with that is being with colleagues and with the different discussions that we have, and I wish I had more of those that help articulate again and again who it is and what is it that I do, and then just becoming more comfortable with myself.
I would respond about your state certification. That is another option for some of you with theological training. But unfortunately, that particular board has not led us to become licensed clinical pastoral therapist, as in some other states, which might raise the bar. The certified fee-based practicing pastoral counselor designation is harder than LPC. It is harder than LMFT, and I supervise for all of them. You've got to have 2 graduate degrees. You've got to know your own theory. You've got to present clinical material to a committee about that. You've got to meet with a committee. It's far more stringent than passing a multiple choice exam. So it's one that's reflective more about formation. So this particular credential is not known by many. There's probably less than 50 or 60 in the whole state. But nonetheless, it is a very stringent process that people go through with that. But sometimes groups like that have to be about their own advocacy and the advocacy of others, wherein it's possible to be able to care. One of the things I would say in the marketplace is there's more work than all of us can do. Even though there's a glut of therapists in Charlotte, you can go not far from Charlotte and there's not anybody to see people. And the fields are wide in the harvest, but the laborers are few. And the groups need to be working together. I used to be in Tennessee. I am licensed over there, although retired. And the group that we were meeting with from Nashville mostly were the Tennessee chapter for licensed clinical pastoral therapists. In that state, unlike any state I know of anywhere, everybody advocated for them. LPCs, LMFTs, psychiatrists, psychologists. And the question now in the world is, who is going to care for the soul? Who's the specialist for doing that? We can't just all be GPs trying to do specialized work. And I would say to those of you in the congregation, these are 3 esteemed colleagues of mine who do depth work, who do caring work. And I'm proud of each of you and what you bring to this community and to our conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. It's not really easy to be on a panel to discuss somebody you don't know, that you discover, that you met, and you engage. But such is the way it is every day when a new client comes into our office. Now, we're going to move to another portion of the conversation. This endeavor was set aside originally to be a workshop type experience for emerging professionals and scholars. And I'm so glad those of you came with that purpose in mind. The question is, if we were to do something like this, not only for you, but have you be a part, shall we say, of a cluster or a chapter in this general area of AAPC. And we may or may not have a major presenter, but we may have, say, a panel like this of presenters. Would this be the sort of thing that would be of interest to those of you seated here to come to events like that? I'm seeing some of, well, 2 or 3 of you, several of you that are EPS folks in particular are nodding your heads. Those of you who are licensed folks, Gary and of course George, you're about to be before long, and the folks on the panel, would this be something y'all would be interested in AAPC doing, having a cluster or a chapter in this area where people could get together periodically and receive CEUs for? This is our conversational point. Maybe we could ask, first of all, how about the folks out here that nodded your heads? Why you would be interested in doing that?
I think it's a community where we can, talk amongst other professionals, amongst other students, to really kind of understand more about the depth of how we can integrate into both the medical field as well as into the, I'll say, the religious field, and to do it as, I guess, to learn from other experts and to learn from each other. I think it would just be a good community.
And I'm obviously interested in psychotherapy, but also strongly interested in soul care. I think that's very important. Blending the whole person is very, very interesting to me. I think that one thing that's lacking is the area of trying to reach people on a deeper level. That seems to be avoided. But I think that people should be approached on all their levels, emotionally, mentally, and also has a person who is of deeper meaning and values. And so I'm just interested in learning more from people in, like all of you, I'm interested in learning that and how you approach dealing with people on that level as well.
We had one more head nodder.
Well, I agree with what everyone else said, but no one is an island, and no one is one thing. And we are all body, mind, soul, everything. And if we don't address each one of those aspects, then no one's going to get any healing at all. So I would love to see more of these types of programs. I would come. I'm sure you would want to do that too. But if you guys want to do it, please, because it's so helpful.
The reason I bring this up, and then we'll get the panel to respond to this, is that the membership division of the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, and in this case the Southeast region, through the efforts of Donna Scott and Dick Brule, are looking at how AAPC might be rejuvenated at the local level by events such as this, where we meet and we invite our colleagues who may not be pastoral therapists by orientation, but may have interest in the holistic work, integrative work. So let me hear from those of you on the panel your thoughts about this.
I think one of our discussions at Canuga 2 years ago was to have we always meet every October, and then to have a mid-year meeting, January, February, hour and a half to 2 hours with either breakfast or lunch, whichever would work best. And the last one we had was when God is on trial. In other words, when a person you're seeing has a rupture in their theology. This 60-year-old woman whose son is 28, a professional bicycle rider. He's killed in Concord while training, and the aftermath of that was something where God was in control up to that point, and to deal with her in that very potent theological issue in a psychotherapeutic setting over a 2-year period. Those kinds of discussions, difficult cases, difficult people you see, people you just soon may not come, those kinds of situations that are real, sort of where the rubber hits the road, discussions can be very helpful. So we will have the email list here, and if we keep creating an email list of people in this region, it'd be pretty easy to send out a blast of when the next one would be, if there's interest.
I'm very interested in it for a practical reason, being that it is hard to find continuing education that is integrative in nature between psychotherapy and theology. And then just from a collegial reason of being able to get together and discuss and be together.
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, AAPC has evolved or devolved over the 30 years I've been associated with it, from trying to carve out a place in the therapy culture as specialists, that we kind of represent those who protect the soul of therapy. I think part of our challenge is to let go of that myth and to extend the soul of therapy to the community of all therapists who are interested in depth work, in soul work. And they exist across disciplines. And that's where I would like to see AAPC intentionally put more of its energy in developing that kind of real collegiality.
Of course, on your evaluation forms, if you have thoughts about this, you could put those down. If you have interest in gatherings like this, we would delight in being able to know about that. When the region, through a cluster or a chapter, whatever it goes by, offers this, we can offer NBCC CEUs for licensure renewal. And we could do it in a fairly inexpensive way. For example, just recently, all we have to do, for example, is pay $25 to have an event that's approved, and then $2. That's a pretty good CEU deal. A lot of folks can't afford to go to larger meetings because you're talking about lodging, food, not to mention travel, time. And so there are ways that are emerging now through webinars, et cetera, that may make this sort of thing possible to do even from your computer. For example, in this system here, this is where we do a number of the grand rounds that are dispensed to all of the hospitals within the CHS system. And if somebody can't come, they can come back later and click a link, and they're there in their own time and space. I'm thinking that AAPC is looking more toward this, and we're wanting this membership in AAPC to mean something and not just be something to check off as a credential. And John, I think you addressed this explicitly. Some of us have tried to say that AAPC does not own pastoral counseling, let alone the soul. And so one of the exciting things of training people from different traditions is hearing how different people experience that and articulate that. So I think it would be a good formation for a number of us. I wonder if there are other comments or questions about other meetings or topics that you would find interesting to address. Let me just ask one question as you think about that. How many of you, when you trained to be a therapist, when you went through your academic program, how many of you were taught how to make a living doing this work? There is my hand is up just to illustrate. I wasn't. Nobody in this room was trained to make a living doing this work. It seems to me that's a viable thing to think about. How do you take care of yourself while making a living, while being, as John put it, the middle child between these worlds? And how do you do that with integrity? How do you do that with appropriate self-care? That, to me, is a reasonable thing to think about. So what are other topics that some of you might have? Anybody who's not...
Well, there are nuances of just as what we did here today. The video is to be able to work with people on video. They don't have to come, they can't, their driving is a problem. Distance. The distance is eliminated as a problem, and you can work on their iPad back and forth. The internet speed is picking up, AT&T and Google, and the way we work could radically change in 5 years.
It is immediately changing now. A large portion of the psychiatry that takes place in this 45 hospital system is through telemedicine. Only 10% of the 12 million patient hours this last year took place in a hospital. The rest of them were more in an outpatient site. And the psychiatrists are spending a lot of their time on the computers through the technology such as this, doing diagnosis, treatment, et cetera, et cetera. To put in a plug for an organization, the Center for Credentialing and Education, there is actually a credential called the Distance Credential Counselor. A licensed person can go take that training and learn the plus and minuses of doing that kind of work. There are 19 licensure boards in the United States that will accept this form of supervision for licensing. And it may be the wave of the future for care.
Can you get that training through the internet? Or do you have to go?
There has been discussion about that. You can go to Greensboro, Gary, to the Center for Credentialing and Education for an intensive weekend and learn about this and do CEUs. And so it's not out there, it's continuing. I know therapists have done this for a long time. Their clients move, or the therapist moves sometimes for a period of time. They've met by phone. You've not lived until you've done a session with the wife in the room, and the husband is in Hong Kong, and it's 10:30 at night, and I'm sitting in my office working, doing couples therapy with both of them while he is away with his job for 3 months at a very critical time in the life of the marriage. So that sort of stuff is very real, up close and personal. Other thoughts about topics?
You mentioned the integrated part with working with hospitals and therapeutic community. Gary Gunderson is someone who has been working sort of the triad area around CareNet and also in Greensboro and making contacts with other hospitals. He's a very interesting person to listen to. His ideas. The Memphis model, I think, is what that would be an interesting person to hear from.
Actually, Gary Gunderson was one of the 3 major presenters at the APC National Convention in St. Louis back in April. Memphis happens to be my hometown originally, and the importance of that model there, particularly in caring. And just to note this, one of the things he mentioned is that in the new system he's in now, they were wanting to lay off some of the custodians, and because it was a cutback. Well, the frequent flyers into the hospital system were studied. Guess where those frequent flyers lived? They lived in the communities where the custodians lived. And so the hospital system decided to give the custodians part of their time on the clock to go care for these people who were the frequent flyers, so it would not dink the system. I know frequent flyers into the CHS system, it cost about $2,000 a visit and unreimbursed services provided. I understand in that system it's $2,400. And so this is a person who's saying, what can the church do? What can the hospital systems do? How do we care for people in the community? But his comment was, if you decide to let these people go, then I'll be the next person that leaves, because what we're trying to do here won't work. And you need a prophetic voice like that in the healthcare system for that to occur. Other thoughts? Okay.
Somebody mentioned a therapeutic situation where clients would be seeing their church members in the lobby. I don't remember who said it, but what can we all do to get rid of the stigma that seems to be attached to going to therapy within just about every other church that I've ever been involved with? It seems like Christians distrust other Christians who are going to therapy. Why is that, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think Teresa sort of hit the nail on the head, which is education, and the lunch and learn types of things, which are, one would hope, relatively non-threatening, but help take some of the mystery out of what's happening behind that door. I would think that would be one of the chief ways. Also to get the pastor, sit down and talk with the pastor, and see if there are bridges of understanding there, and the pastor to speak about it also.
Yeah, I think too that, you know, people have a stigma about psychotherapy because of their defenses. And when people's defenses are up, things like education are helpful, but they don't change their defenses. So if we can, as pastoral counselors, can be available and accessible when the defenses are down, which is usually during a crisis, when there's been some sort of shadow eruption, there's been a suicide in the congregation, or there's been one of the leaders' marriages has crumbled, or a job loss, or there's been sexual abuse or a scandal in the congregation. Rather than staying on the perimeter and just doing our work behind closed doors, I think we have opportunities to interject ourselves when those defenses are down and show that we're pastoral counselors, but we're human beings. And we can normalize breakdowns. It's not a stigma. It's just part of what Rollins was talking about. It's part of our humanity.
There's a humorous story by David. David is a Episcopal rector in a city in this state, and he had been married for about 3 years. David is quite open, and he was approaching, his wife was approaching, they'd been married about 3 years, and she was approaching her 50th birthday or something like that. And he was telling this in his sermon on Sunday morning. He said, I asked my wife, what could I give her for her 50th birthday? And she thought a few minutes, and she said, I'd like for you to see a psychiatrist. And when the pastor's that open, it communicates something about it's okay to have problems, issues. It doesn't mean you're crazy. It's hard to get that into the culture, though.
Are there other comments or questions about either the theme for today or future meetings?